Karen, thank you very much, and I want to thank the World Bank CSO process, the forum, for enabling us to have the meeting today. And I want to pay tribute to Karen's leadership as the director of Revenue Watch, the wonderful work that Revenue Watch is doing in the area that we're discussing today, really making a breakthrough, a historic breakthrough in new institutional directions for ensuring that resources can actually work for development. And today we have a chance to talk a little bit amongst ourselves first, and then open it up for discussion with an interested community here of practitioners and students and members of civil society organizations. It is probably right to start with the paradox of the resource curse, and for me, a paper that I published quite a while ago that looked at how economic growth differed between resource-rich and resource-poor countries. And the finding of that paper was that over the period of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the resource-rich countries had performed much more poorly in economic growth than the resource-poor countries. And this was quite surprising, obviously, for many reasons, the most important of which is that resource abundance should be, and certainly can be in theory, a means for propelling economic development. But for all too many countries, we know that's not been the case. Sometimes actually resource discoveries have been the occasion of almost the complete collapse of a country rather than its economic development. For me, one of the striking examples of this in recent years, although I wouldn't say collapse is the right adjective, but the striking phenomenon has been Bolivia, which country I know well and have worked in for off and on for 25 years, when it was found that the natural gas deposits were about 10 times what had been assumed, based on further exploration or revelation of revealing of results of exploration. One could say that the political system ended up having a nervous breakdown. It was so much to handle, the prospect of this wealth, that the bitterness that arose within the society and the claims and the counterclaims meant that before 1 cubic foot of this was actually produced, the country went into paroxysms of division, unrest, a coup, or a toppling of a government, and so forth. And that's an extreme case. You don't even have to produce anything to have the curse. You just have to find out that it's under the ground, and that can be enough to derange the political process. So the question is, has been, for me, at an intellectual level since then, why is this the case? And there are basically two kinds of theories, and both could be true or neither could be true. But one is that the resources somehow derange politics, or at least threaten to derange politics, and the general explanation is that politics becomes a scramble for appropriable resources rather than a process of careful development. So something goes wrong when there are these high-value resources to be had, and this can mean corruption, it can mean internal unrest, it can mean greater division, but there's something mediated through the political process that goes seriously awry. The second kind of explanation is more economic-based, that there's something about the resource sectors which perhaps by leading to strong consumption and currency overvaluation, the so-called Dutch disease, or by taking resources away from what otherwise would be knowledge sectors or sectors with rapid technological advance. Something intrinsic is problematic with oil, gas, minerals, and other resource and other resource-based sectors of the economy. I think there still are arguments about both of these, but I think it's also fair to say that the theory is quite clear and the logic is quite clear that the resource curse can't be an inevitability. It can only be a possibility and a paradox, because having more resources, if properly utilized, in other words, if the policy and institutional framework is right, has to be an advantage compared to having fewer resources. There has to be a way to get some benefit out of this, whether it's through designing stronger political institutions, more transparent institutions, or managing the macroeconomy in a way that prevents the worst of the Dutch disease. Theoretically, it's almost certain that having more is better than having less, at least in potential. And so that raises the policy side of this issue, rather than looking as an outsider, simply giving a scorecard of how resource-rich and resource-poor countries are doing, rather to ask the question, what can be done to strengthen the capacity of converting natural resources into successful, sustainable development. And that's really the topic for today. And both Karen and I, in various ways, and now happily together also in the case of Timor-Leste, and working with the government there, are looking for mechanisms to strengthen the framework for turning underground natural resource wealth into above the ground economic development. And if we get a PowerPoint, I'm going to talk about a few of the dimensions of that. But without that, let me just continue to talk for a few minutes and be happy to share the very simple slides with anybody that would like them afterwards. First, this is an extremely timely discussion, not just today at the World Bank IMF meetings, but in these years, because resource-based development is more promising than it has been for a long time because of high natural resource prices. And so we're living through a period where most primary commodities prices are at, if not all-time historic highs, definitely at higher levels than they've been during the past 20 years. And that's true of hydrocarbons prices, it's true of minerals, non-hydrocarbon minerals prices of various sorts, and it's true also of food grain prices, which of course soared 2 years ago, came down a bit, but remain much higher than they were at the beginning of this past decade. So we have three areas of natural resource-based development: agriculture, minerals, and fossil fuel resources that are experiencing a tremendous surge of investor interest. A huge amount of this obviously relates to China's economic growth. I haven't been in a country recently where I haven't been told that China has just become that country's leading trade partner. I was in Chile last week, and Chile now has China as its leading trade partner, and all of a sudden the perspective is not north-south, but across the Pacific, and how China-Chilean relations are going to change the dynamic. Chile serving as a hub for China's investments, as well as Chile providing copper and other primary commodities for the Chinese market. This morning's Financial Times has an insert about South Africa mentioning that China has just become South Africa's leading trade partner. And this is being replicated in dozens of countries right now. China's demands for hydrocarbons, for feed grains, for other kinds of minerals, ferrous and non-ferrous metals, is voracious and probably with many decades to come. leading development. Was this already installed?
No.
Almost there. It just says WB World Bank. And of course, what we're seeing is not only China, but other major emerging markets having a dramatically increasing role, both on the resource-based development side as well as on the market demand side. That one? Yep. WB at the bottom. Good. Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. So you have, for example, the remarkable rise of Brazil right now, not only as a supplier of primary commodities, but Vale, for example, which is the founding donor of the Vale Columbia Center, becoming a huge mining force throughout Africa. In southern Africa, in Mozambique, now in West Africa, recently having purchased the world's second largest iron ore deposit, the first largest being in Brazil itself, and the second largest being in Guinea. And so the whole dynamic of this sector is a tremendous amount of dynamism, a tremendous amount of foreign investment in low-income countries, and therefore this issue of the resource curse being more predominant than it has been for, or more potentially important for a lot of newcomer countries to this than has been true until the very recent past. This is just a slide showing the real price of all primary commodities, since this is around 50 here and around 140. We have nearly a tripling of real commodities prices since the beginning of the decade, and that's true for non-oil, not quite, roughly almost a doubling, and then real oil prices since 1990 till now, with an index having doubled. Grain prices a little bit more complicated, but what used to be a reliable decline of grain prices has stopped declining, and probably, though they're very highly volatile right now, probably an upswing and a persistent increase of the real price of several of the crucial agricultural staple crops: wheat, rice, maize, and soybeans. And that's leading to a very significant increase of interest in buying farmland, or what would be farmland, throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and raising a lot of questions about sustainability, equity, and even political stability, since at least one of these deals has contributed to a toppling of government, the attempted purchase by a Korean firm of a large plot of land in Madagascar, which was one of the factors that contributed to the coup in Madagascar a couple of years ago. So many new discoveries: Uganda, onshore oil; Mozambique, the development of huge coal deposits; Guinea, what has been a long delayed onset of development in their massive iron ore deposits, the so-called Simandou deposits, are now about to begin. Ghana has discovered very significant offshore oil. Liberia now seems that it has offshore oil roughly in the same geologic deposit, same with Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire, and Angola has recently discovered, though quite deep, offshore oil as well to add to its quite considerable reserves. So we're in a period where this is really a key issue for pricing, markets, participants, and all the rest. And I think the key challenge for us is to see this in a full life cycle or holistic way. The challenges of natural resource development are pretty much from the inception of exploration through to the long-term development of the country. Resources, the resource sector in heavily resource-dependent economies plays a quite pervasive role. And putting the pieces together of all of these roles into a suitable institutional framework for a country that has come upon natural resource deposits is not easy. And when we met a couple of weeks ago on the occasion of the MDG summit, Karen and I and our colleagues with a number of ministers in Africa who are either long-standing resource-dependent economies like Botswana and Namibia, or new to be resource-based economies or oil-based economies like Ghana. The basic plea was help. Help with a holistic framework in which the tremendous stresses that come with having large resource deposits can be handled. Because these are potentially very, very destabilizing very quickly, and governments, especially governments in poor countries, have an extremely difficult time handling the range of challenges, whether it's the proper negotiation with heavyweights internationally, or whether it's managing public expectations, or whether it's balancing the interests of the resource region with the national interests, or whether it's somehow integrating properly the resource sector into the development strategy, or whether it's handling the macroeconomics of the natural resource revenue flows. Every one of these is pretty tough, and no country has an easy time, whether it's a high-income country or a very poor country. But a poor country coming into this in the first time is likely to feel quite overwhelmed. So, in the interest of simply opening the discussion, let me talk about a few of the issues in this overall life cycle of resource-based development. There are the issues of establishing the proper contracts, because almost always these resource deposits are developed by some combination of local and international actors. And the international actors bring technology, bring capital, bring markets, and therefore, inevitably, in the low-income countries, play a very important role. But making sure that they're playing a reasonable role is not so easy. Second is seeing these projects in the context of the economic development locally where the project is occurring, regionally, but by regional I mean subnational, where the project is usually part of a subnational infrastructure or subnational development challenge. There are often supranational challenges as well, because maybe getting the natural resource, say from Zambia or DRC or Mozambique out to the international markets requires crossing one or two international borders. Maybe it requires a regional power grid, a regional rail infrastructure. So there can be multiple countries involved as well in the development challenge. The third area is the macroeconomic management. If it's right that this resource is a large part of the national economy, then it's also true that the revenues that will flow from this to the national economy are likely to be very large relative to the budget. and the spending that will come from those revenues is likely to be quite large relative to the annual national product, for example. And in that regard, there's a big macroeconomic challenge, and I would say quite a bit of debate and confusion on this point. And the biggest debate coming under the heading of the Dutch disease, which is a topic that is much misunderstood, I would say, and therefore bears just a few minutes of discussion. The fourth area I would say is that almost any of these deposits, when monetized, represents a very substantial opportunity for long-term economic development, in that the magnitudes are large, not only relative to the economy, but for the countries that I mentioned, the best opportunities to finance long-term investments in infrastructure or in human capital. And so converting the capital asset under the ground into capital assets above the ground, which I think is at the essence of a national development program, is also absolutely central for these discussions. And finally, in order to maintain a proper process and, I would say, social and political stability, the theory of Karen's organization, Revenue Watch, the theory of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, and a view that I wholly subscribe to, that transparent public scrutiny and to the maximum extent possible, proper democratic governance over these resources can play an enormously beneficial role in making sure they do all the things that they have the potential to do, and in avoiding the resource curse. So getting this 5-point, or depending on how you parse it, 4 or 6 stage part of this development is really the nature of avoiding the curse and turning the natural resource abundance into successful economic development. Let me quickly say a few words about each of these areas, and then I'm going to turn it over to Karen. On contracting, of course, there is an incredible range of choices that countries potentially face. What type of contract? Is it a concession? Is it a production sharing agreement? Is it some kind of build, operate, transfer arrangement, and so forth? Is it a national development company that contracts for certain services internationally so that all of the resources remained owned domestically? Many types of contractual choices, many types of bidding processes, because what you include in a bid for a concession, what kinds of standards, what kinds of investment guarantees, what kinds of performance requirements, is an art, and a very complex one. What is going to be made public about the contracting process? I think one of the hardest things for natural resource based governments is that they have a very hard time understanding what they should do, because they have a very hard time making comparisons of terms with other countries, because most of these contracts are held at least partially, if not fully, confidentially. And I think this is something that really needs to be busted open completely, in my view, because the company's interests in the confidentiality, I think, are rarely suitable grounds for maintaining confidentiality vis-a-vis the public, and the high social costs of having many of these contracts remain confidential has been extraordinary. I was shocked. This is why Karen's right that sometimes I annoy people upstairs in this building. I was very dismayed that when the World Bank oversaw, in a way, the Chad-Cameroon pipeline and put in international public money when you tried to find out what the actual contract was in Chad for the development of the oil, the bank wouldn't reveal it. That was confidential. I was quite shocked because there was a lot of public money and the World Bank's imprimatur going into that arrangement. I think it turned out to be a very bad deal on all sides and was completely useless from Chad's development perspective. But part of the problem was that it was secret, and it remained secret even after the process went forward. There are lots of choices on taxation and royalties, equity participation, and so forth that are very hard for governments to make. I have a hard time advising governments also because there is no good international comparison of standards and best practices in this. And building up a database in this area, I think, is a very high priority. There are many issues about how to share various kinds of risks that are part of good contracting and also quite subtle and complicated. And then finally, there are the issues of dispute settlement under the contracts where there are alternative choices that need to be attended to. So all of this is to say that the contracting process ain't simple. And if you're doing this from the point of view of a low-income country that's where some oil has been discovered, it's a very, very hard process to get right. And there are very few guideposts to getting it right. And you can hire an expensive law firm to help you do it, but that law firm probably is not really your best development partner in this. And I'd say that we still are a long way to go in building up the databases and knowledge bases for best practices, though there's been some advance through Revenue Watch and other initiatives. Second big area is the project development. And again, there are lots of choices to be made with respect to the development of an oil field or the development of a copper mine or a coal mine, or I should say a coal deposit, how it's to be done, what kind of environmental standards, how the local communities are to be treated, how the national government will interact with the say provincial or local government in terms of revenue sharing, how infrastructure is to be developed, and so forth. Pretty important choices. It's typical, for example, that any of these major projects needs quite a bit of infrastructure. You have to build rail often, you have to build power, you have to build pipelines, and so forth. How this is done can be the difference of having an enclave project that has no spillovers or being a beginning or a nucleus of a successful regional development. In the, both the Vale's big mining projects, the one in Mozambique, which is Moati's coal deposit, a huge, one of the world's largest coal deposits, or the Simandou iron ore deposits in Guinea. Both of these require massive amounts of energy, and they require rail. So Vale and the host countries will be building hundreds of kilometers of rail. Now, it's possible that that rail is just dedicated nothing from coal to port, and it has no spillover at all. Or it's possible that it becomes a base for regional freight and passenger rail. So depending on how this is done, the infrastructure can be a piece of dedicated infrastructure that has no spillovers, or it can be quite important. In the Chad pipeline, the only electricity generated for the project was the electricity used to pump the oil. So Chad was left with fuel wood and no electricity, and there was one power plant built in the project, and it was built for the pumping station. And there was no consideration given to actually using any of the energy resources for the country's own electrification. I think rather shocking failure of imagination on the side of all of the parties to that deal. But this is all to say that when you're developing a project, it should be developed from the point of view of larger development needs. And a lot of the infrastructure is dual use, if I could put it that way. It's for the project itself, but it can be part of the infrastructure for the broader region. Macroeconomic management, lots of issues. Should there be a dedicated fund for the natural resources? Typically, if those natural resources are a very large proportion of the budget, there are good reasons to have a dedicated fund for the purposes of transparency, macroeconomic management over the short term, and long-term management of the revenue and spending streams. What kind of spending trajectory should one take from a natural resource project? This is a big and confused issue. One standard is smooth the income over time. So basically, to enforce consumption smoothing, there's a certain logic to that when you're talking about spending for consumption. There may be no logic at all to that when you're talking about using the resources from the project for public investment, because you don't smooth investment the same way you smooth consumption. For investment, you want to actually make upfront the high return investments that are made possible by these natural resources. So in the case of Timor-Leste, where we're working together, the country is the lucky recipient of quite large oil revenues per capita right now that are much larger per person than the non-oil GNP per capita. So it's more than doubling the gross domestic product and the gross national product. And the issue has come up how to spend that money. And there are many complexities to this. First, even if you say simply to smooth the consumption, realizing that this is a finite resource that in 20 or 25 years from this site will be gone, and so you want to smooth the use of it beyond that, you have to take care to realize that this is a country that probably will have many reservoirs developed over time. And so even calculating what consumption smoothing really is not a simple mechanical exercise from a single oil concession. Second, Timor-Leste happens to be a country with, because of becoming newly independent and a least developed country, a country that has very, very, very poor infrastructure. So the roads, the power, the clinics, the schools, and so forth all have to be built almost from scratch. It was also a country that was, what little was there was heavily damaged or destroyed during the fighting a decade ago around the time of independence. So, rather than smoothing the use of the hydrocarbon revenue stream, one would say invest ahead of the actual stream coming online to build the power, the roads, and other infrastructure and the clinics and schools that are crucial for the country to get off the ground. So I just raised this as part of the macroeconomic management. Then there's a whole set of risk management issues, quite complicated. Can a country hedge its copper risk? Can it hedge its oil risk? Or should it merely smooth year-to-year fluctuations as best it can? Lots of financial issues that are raised. How should it invest the funds? Should this be a sovereign wealth fund, or should it be invested very conservatively in treasury bills and so forth? And then finally, what I think is extremely important in macroeconomic management is having a scenario or framework that's at least 5 years time horizon, and ideally 10 or more years. Governments have a very hard time in this. The United States time horizon is 2 November elections. It's at best a budget year at a time. We don't even think about beyond the annual budget, or hardly think about beyond the annual budget right now. But when you're dealing with a poor country and a vast natural resource deposit that's quite large relative to the size of the economy, planning on a 5 or 10-year horizon is both difficult, but I would say essential for development success. And this is part of what needs to be built institutionally. Finally, let me just say a word about national development strategy. The essence of the strategy, in my opinion, is to turn natural capital under the ground into physical and human capital above the ground. This is basically a capital allocation problem. And that means that it's not basically the problem of turning capital under the ground into financial wealth above the ground in an investment fund. But for a poor country, the main challenge is to use the natural resource wealth effectively to build the infrastructure and to build the human capital, the health, the education, the nutrition of the people in the economy. That, again, requires a 5 to 10-year planning framework. It requires a serious set of sector plans, which are all hard to make, and typically are not made right now except by a few countries. I've come very much to admire China's 5-year plans or India's 5-year plans as crucial mechanisms for making serious public investment analyses. I'd say that's all the more important in this context, where essentially what you have before you is a complicated, multi-sector, multi-year investment program that needs to be successfully carried out. And carried out mainly by the public sector, which is also something that is pretty tricky. It may be that private companies play an important role in the actual implementation, but this is public revenues that are going to be translated into crucial long-term investments of an undercapitalized economy. And so one needs strong national institutions that can do the analyses of what kind of infrastructure is needed, what kind of investments in the health sector, what kind of investments in the education sector, how much does it cost to give universal primary or secondary education. Same kind of question that you ask, how much does it cost to pave a kilometer of highway? And typically when you get started in any of these exercises, no one knows the answers to any of these things, because most development is not done in such an organized manner. And public investment in these poor countries that have come to find these major resources typically has been extremely sporadic. What can be financed from a World Bank project or from an African Development Bank project? Very little is coming out of national resources, and all of a sudden the country has an opportunity for a significant domestically financed public investment program. Yikes! That's a big problem and a big challenge, and I would say that it is probably the fundamental challenge to getting all of this right. Now, last is, and my segue to Karen, I've talked longer than I had planned to, is the role of transparency in getting all of this right. This will not work if it's a secretive operation, because every step of what I talked about, whether it's the local infrastructure development, the treatment of the communities, the budgeting process, and so forth, has to be a public process in order to have basic legitimacy, and also, of course, to avoid the massive amounts of corruption that so easily surround this sector. This is, in my experience, a uniquely corrupt part of the world economy. It's just too easy to steal this money. You have huge value in a small area. It's a pretty competitive sector, so companies are ready to pay bribes to get in for those rents. There's lots of fly-by-night operations. lots of quick wins and quick killings that can be made. This is an easily abused sector. And to get things right, even if it weren't easily abused, would also be hugely complicated and require many players, many sectors, and many political and institutional processes. All of that, in my view, means transparency is essential so that there can be the active public debate and dialogue, confidence building that is needed to get right a process that's going to take a generation or even more.